Kia ora and welcome to this Manaaki Whenua LINKOnline webinar. Today we will introduce the Protected Areas Network for New Zealand, or PANZ for short, a dataset compiled to support a range of national reporting and other requirements quite some years ago. Since then, the drivers for this information have changed and the number and quality of data sources that could be included has absolutely exploded. So it's timely to review and consider the scope for a modern PANZ. MFE have contracted Manaaki Whenua to undertake some initial scoping for the redevelopment of PANZ to include new data sets and meet future needs for a comprehensive spatial data product. Simon Planzer is a data scientist at Manaaki Whenua and leads this project, and he's joined by Stella Belliss. Together, they will outline the opportunities and challenges identified in the first phase of this project, along with the next steps for phase 2. We have a question for you, unusually, so stay tuned to respond to that. Then we will have time for a few questions and answers. But first, I'm going to hand over to Fiona Hodge. Fiona is the subject matter specialist at MFE, and she'll talk to us about the reasons that this project is so important.
Kia ora, thank you, Christine, and thank you, Tiffany, as well. And kia ora koutou katoa. So mapping the extent of legally protected areas in New Zealand is critical for so many reasons, and that seems pretty obvious. So we need to understand how much legal protection we have to be able to report on some of those international commitments we've made, as well as to inform our national reporting and to help with development of policy and local governance. The questions we need to answer is how much is protected, where is it, in which regions, which environments, which ecosystems, and probably more importantly, where is it not? And mapping legally protected areas sounds like a pretty easy challenge until you think about it a bit further. Firstly, what does it mean to be protected? And we know not all legal protection is equal. So you can compare a national park status compared to a historic reserve. And how do we capture that variation and that quality of legal protection? And even once you figure out those questions about what it means to be protected, the next questions are more technical. So how do you compile all of those areas under legal protection into a single layer, ensure it's maintained and up to date? And then there's also some governance questions. We need to acknowledge that there's a large number of administrators of this data involved, including hopefully many of you in the room, the virtual room today. And then finally, how do you make this data as accessible as possible, but also account for some valid privacy issues? And these are the questions that MFE has been funding Manaaki Whenua to explore over the last few months and beginning another contract now. And so I'd like to thank Simon and Stella for all their work on these questions and hand it over to them to explore them further. Kia ora.
Thank you, Fiona. So I'll be speaking about, well, here's an introduction to what I will be speaking about. I'll be speaking about PANZ. This is the product that aggregates and stores the protected area network data. So here on out, you're going to hear PANZ a lot. So I'll be speaking to some of the drivers of why PANZ has really been thrown into the spotlight recently and their importance around the protected area data sets. I'll be speaking to some work we've done around the data sources with protected area data, and Stella will be speaking to our next piece of work looking at the scoping of PANZ around engagement. So what is PANZ? So it brings together information on legally protected areas at a national level. And so it's not a data creator, it's a data aggregator. So it aggregates data from central government, from trusts such as Queen Elizabeth II National Trust, and local governments. And it underpins a lot of conservation efforts, some of those which I'll speak to shortly. But it is funded ad hoc. Funding tends to be when products need information from PANZ themselves. A PANZ version is generated and updated, meaning that it's not maintained and ready for use when needed. So a lot of policy has really put attention to protected areas. So the biodiversity strategy, Te Mana o Te Tao, for example, calls to ecosystems and species are protected, restored, resilient, and connected from mountain tops to ocean depths. This connectedness is something that we see again and again in policy. So New Zealand are also signatories to the Human Montreal Global Biodiversity Frameworks 30 by 30, something we've heard about often in these linked presentations. So under that, the goal is to have 30% of global land areas and sea areas, especially those important to biodiversity, conserved through connected systems of protected areas. So with these two examples of policy and strategy, a national level protected area data set is going to be very important to measuring, baselining where we are, but also measuring our progress towards these goals and supporting us make decisions about achieving those goals. So next year, New Zealand has an obligation to report on our progress towards 3030, and a system such as PANS is going to be integral to that. And we see really interesting use when we go looking to see how PANS is used to support conservation. And we see articles such as this where the authors have taken PANS, overlaid the distribution of endangered ground threatened beetles, and they come to conclusions such as the data strongly suggests that the current spatial distribution of site-based conservation as reflected by PANS is inadequate to protect a highly endemic caribid fauna. So by overlaying distributions of endangered species with the protections, we can see how the species are protected and make decisions about the future of protected areas. So this real, not new, but ongoing importance of having protected areas aggregated at a national level has kicked off a piece of work funded by the Ministry for the Environment. And that initial piece of work was to identify the types of protected areas, the sources of data for those protected areas, record any gaps in data, assess the maturity of the data sources for protected area data, and I'll speak to significant natural areas. And we have also developed a draft survey that is the intent is to gather information from entities about the protected area data they hold. So it wasn't too onerous gathering information on the types of protected area. Former colleagues of ours and former colleagues of ours and others have compiled a great list of all legally protected, in this case, terrestrial protected areas. And we can see an example of a few of them here to get an idea of what these protected areas I'm talking about are. So we have national parks under the National Park Act, we have reserves under the Reserves Act, and we have designated protected areas under the Conservation Act, and there are many more. So the same colleagues and others have also classified New Zealand's protected areas, those that they had identified. And that's because not every protected area provides the same level of protection to biodiversity. And that's important. We want to have these classifications, so when interacting with systems such as PANS, a researcher that's interested or a piece of work interested in just those highest protections can extract those protected areas that do provide those highest protections. And very usefully, those New Zealand classifications of protected areas have been mapped to international classifications to enable collaboration with international communities. So we did use it as the basis of identifying types of protected areas, but there are some we'd like to add to that list. And those are those internationally protected areas, such as Ramsar wetlands, where New Zealand is obliged to protect these internationally significant wetlands. Marine protected areas, we believe, should be included in any future versions of the PANS product. And that speaks to that connectedness from the ocean's depths to the mountain tops that recent policy speaks to. Te Urewera National Park is a given that should be included. But we don't think a PANS system should be limited to just what we discussed. Architecture should allow new identified protected areas to be added to the system as it's developed. And we also reviewed the significant natural areas. So council have had to protect areas with significant Indigenous biodiversity since the Resource Management Act 1991 was introduced, but there has been an increased mandate for councils to do this, to map and specifically map these areas under the very recent National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity. If we look at the view here, we have Porirua City Council, and the orange are the significant natural areas within that region. And we can see just how larger extent that these SNAs provide protection to biodiversity. And this is, I would assume, high quality biodiversity, because councils have gone out there and made the decision based on the quality of that Indigenous fauna and flora. So the conclusion is these should be included in any future version of PANS. But with that comes increased complexity. These are managed at the territorial authority level, of which there are 67. So that significantly increases the amounts of data providers of this important data that we want to aggregate. So part of our methodology was, once we had identified these protected area types, we went looking for data sources to match those so we could populate the national level database. Where we couldn't find data sources, these are known as data gaps. And so a data gap refers to incomplete or missing data that are required in order to obtain a full picture at a national level of where protections have been applied across New Zealand's terrestrial and marine environments. So of particular mention, conservation covenants and protected land as vested to local governments, we believe there are many gaps, and it's actually quite hard to quantify those. We don't know about what we don't know about, but we understand there is a fair bit of this natured protected lands. So it's going to prove to be difficult. SNAs, we did not find even 50% of SNA data sources, but that increased mandates gives time for those areas still to be mapped, so that's not surprising. And we found gaps in some data sets, so there's two types of data gaps: those data sources we can't find, as well as missing data within those sources we identify. Also in this piece of work, of those data sources we identified for inclusion or potential inclusion in PANS, we went and investigated the maturity of those data sources. So three key measures are licensing. Is that data clearly licensed for distribution and reuse? Access, how is that data accessed? Do we have to send an email and hopefully get an email back with an attachment with that data? Or is there a self-service web portal where we can hit download on that data? Or the golden standard, is there an API or web service where our machine can speak to the data provider's machine and request that on our behalf? And is there metadata outlying information about that data, including that license? So the reason data maturity is so important is, again, PANS is an aggregator, not a creator, and we've identified 91 plus data sources. So we are very focused on lowering that transactional cost, and by lowering that, that's how we're going to be successful in aggregating so many different data sources spread out across the country. And I have an image here highlighting just how that would work. In the ideal world, our system sends a request to a server within the data provider. There's a license there, and that license can get carried through to our system. Without that license, we can't release that data publicly. So we can hold it, and it might have been the intent of that data creator to have that data released publicly, but we can't release it to the users of PANS, and the users can't get that value. So that license is very important. So what is the reality of the data sources? We went and investigated this, and we looked at central government data sources, earmarked as potential data sources for protected area databases. And we found there was a high rate of licensing and downloads, not so much of those web services we want to lower that transactional cost. When we go and look at territorial authorities, and in this case, potential data sources of significant natural area data, we found a much lower occurrence of that licensing that enables us to release that data to the PAN's users, and also as web services that reduce the transactional cost of aggregating that data. So we came to a series of recommendations at the end of that piece of work, and PANS does require ongoing funding rather than ad hoc funding to ensure that the data is maintained and up to date and ready for use when required. The data sharing ecosystem of protected area data must be lifted. We believe there's a role in a cross-agency group being formed to do this. Ideally, we wouldn't want to see such a cross-agency group getting involved in direct day-to-day of that, but looking to work with others, trying to solve our common problems of common solutions. So we're aware of the data investments plan, focusing Aotearoa New Zealand's environments reporting system, and these are looking to solve common problems. So we need to look to engage with them and work with those working with similar data providers, also trying to aggregate data. Also, the classifications doesn't extend to those types that we think should be included, and those should be classified within that classification scheme. And PANS should be released under open license, and this is to get full value from the investment in PANS, that organisations, institutions, individuals that would like to use this data can use it. So I'm handing over to Christine now for a poll.
Thanks very much, Simon. We've never done this before, but we have a question for you, our audience. And so you will have a quick poll pop up on your screen. We're curious, does your organisation hold or manage data on protected areas? So we're going to leave this up there for, I don't know, a minute or so. And ask you to let us know, just yes or no. How are we going with that, Tiffany? Are we getting some responses?
Yeah, we had about 70% of the audience respond within that minute. So I've just shared the results on the screen and hopefully that's showing for everyone now.
Fantastic. This is what we suspected. There is a lot of data. There's a lot of data out there. We'll progress back to our presentation now. Stella will pick up the next phase of phase 2 of the project that we are about to get started on, and where you might hear more from us in the future. Stella.
Thank you, Christine and others. Simon's just been outlining to you all the work that we've done in the first phase of our PANS contract work. And for this contract, we've basically been looking at the literature and looking at the work that's been done already. Now, in the second phase, this is the bit where we get to consult widely as much as we possibly can. So within the phase 2 work that we're just about to start, or basically are starting with this webinar, the first thing we're going to do is update the report that we've just written to incorporate new legislation. And then we're going to call a group together online to do a workshop looking at making sure that we've got all the relevant entities included there, and we're going to pick your brains, if you like, to make sure that we're on the right track and carrying out everything that we need to do. And then we're also in this phase going to carry out a survey. We've drafted it in the first phase, and we're going to, after our workshop and after some more consultation, we're going to survey everybody to gather information from the key data providers and the stakeholders and the end users. And please feel free to let us know any people that you think ought to be included in that survey. I'm sure that we will include all of you that are listening to this workshop today in that. And after the survey, we're going to report on that and run another online workshop. But as well as that work, we're also going to do a lot more thinking about how PANS should develop as a database as we go forward. And I guess the holy grail of this is nationally significant databases, and we just know how high the bar is to get something to be accepted as one of those. But by golly, if we're serious about conservation, I think this, if anybody was a good candidate for this, I think perhaps the PANS data would be. Could you move to the next slide, please? Thank you, Simon. So once we've consulted widely and possibly modified our survey a little bit, we'll be sending this out to all the custodians and everybody else on our database lists, and we'll be working hard to engage with all the groups that are also grappling with these problems at the moment. So that's the end of our presentation. We can move now to questions.
Great. And look, there's some amazing questions come through, and I'm going to say up front, we're not going to get through all of these. And also, some of them are a bit tricky and some things that we might not have thought about before. So thank you for those. Rest assured, all the thinking that you put into these things does actually go further in and is really valuable as we're embarking on a project. So great timing. I've got a question first that I think I should throw at Fiona, and that is, do all types of our protected areas in New Zealand meet the minimum standards of the IUCN?
Sorry, I can't answer that, but there's definitely a continuum of protection, which I guess I alluded to in the introduction, and some of the things that are included in the lowest kind of levels of protection in the classification that Simon talked about include things like historic reserves and esplanade strips and road reserves. So they're things that yeah, the primary purpose is definitely not conservation, but that's an outcome. So that I guess Simon was saying that we are, well, the work that they're doing is trying to make sure that there is mapping of those 6 levels of legal protection to the ICUN classifications. And I guess most of our land is not at all legally protected.
Great. Thanks for that. So there's a few tricky ones here, but I'm going to go for an easier one. And this is for Simon. Are the protected areas publicly available as a GIS map layer?
Not in the way. There's a 2007 copy. And that is available on site info, I believe it is. But no, that I might say no to that, and that's why we're undertaking this work, and that's why one of the recommendations is that this data should be released openly, because we understand that how important this is to underpinning other products and decision making. And so that's one of the big drivers for undertaking this piece of work. There needs to be an open version, and that needs to happen sooner than later.
As an interim, we have included in our follow-up email a link to a PANS version on our environment, which is a visualized version. It's not a GIS layer, but there will be a place where, if you are curious, you want to go and see what's there now, you can see some of that data. So there's a link in our follow-up email. And that was a really interesting question, because it's come from a perspective of emergency response and impact assessment for recovery, which of course is something that's top of mind for so many of us right now.
And that just highlights why this should be open and should be up to date and should be available. Because there's just so many things that we haven't thought about that does support. So it's great to hear those things.
Right, now this one. No, there's some questions here I need some interpretation on. So I'm just looking at that. Apart from, this is a great question, apart from spatial information, i.e. location and area, what other data is required for the database? For instance, ecosystem type, current state, how degraded it is, what species are preserved. How detailed will that information be?
So some of that comes down to the type of protected area. So if we're talking about significant natural areas, there are details and what information must be captured there. And that talks about exactly that, what the fauna may be there, for example. So that is very much based on type. For many of them, the national parks and so on, the minimum requirement is that spatial extent, the legislation and the sub-legislation, the sectional legislation which that falls under, and that points to how that is protected. And importantly, there should be a classification. Those classifications we spoke to should be against each of those protected area extents, because it allows people to do interesting things, such as filter on just those that do provide a very high level, significant level of protection to biodiversity.
Right, and I'm just going to squeeze one last one in. I might throw this at Fiona to start with, because I'm not sure that we've got the answer. How does PANS relate to the requirement under the freshwater management regulations for regional councils to identify outstanding natural water bodies?
I'm not sure I can answer that either. I'm not sure about the details of the criteria for an outstanding natural water body, but certainly I think PANS is a really good sort of like input data set to a number of decisions, and can just help regional councils and local users understand the legal context of their landscape. And I guess the important caveat with legal protection is it doesn't necessarily tell you the conditional quality of that land or water. Yeah, which I guess is what Simon was just alluding to. So I can get back to you on that. But I think it's a useful browsing point to start with any kind of spatial delineation.
Exactly. And really the questions that I can see in front of me are drawing attention to a number of things that we might not already have explored properly. So this is really exciting. Thank you so much again. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for attending. Thank you for doing the poll for our first time ever on a webinar. And we will be back next month with another webinar on a separate topic. And so watch your email for the next invitation. Thanks heaps to Fiona, Simon and Stella, and we're done for today. Bye.
Thank you.